Hey everyone, sorry that metabolism presentation I almost forgot to upload it this week, but I wanted to add a few additional narrative pieces for you all. And be sure that you have viewed the previous presentations on digestion and carbs and lipids and stuff, because this is going to make way more sense and the connections will just be clear. So essentially, metabolism, it's how we get and use energy from the foods that we eat or consume. So basically, in a nutshell, it's all of those chemical reactions that happen in our body. And these reactions follow pathways where chemicals will transform from one form into another through these steps in this process called metabolism. Those chemical or biochemical reactions take on one of two forms. So hopefully you've heard of some of these terms, anabolic or catabolic. And anabolic reactions are the ones that consume or use up energy to make something or construct something. And catabolic reactions, those break down bigger molecules and then they'll release energy from that process. So thinking about anabolism, you're taking small aminos and fatty acids and monosaccharides, and you're building them into larger parts like carbohydrates and fats and proteins that are bigger. And the catabolism, it's for when you need to use this energy and you're breaking it down, you're breaking down those bigger molecules, therefore you're releasing the energy that the body needs, and giving your body the fuel to do it all over again. And we often refer to that energy as ATP. So the body uses glucose, that main source of energy, and this monosaccharide, glucose, is what our cells use to make ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. And hopefully it sounds a little familiar to you. And right here's an example of an ATP molecule. So you have like an adenine connected to a ribose sugar attached to 3 phosphate groups over there to the right. And ATP isn't stable enough for us to store it, which is why our cells store energy as glucose instead. So cells catabolize that glucose to ATP when the fuel is needed, and the phosphate bonds store that energy, and breaking off a phosphate group releases the energy. So when we use that energy, we can regenerate it. And this slide illustrates ATP to ADP, where a phosphate group is broken off, and therefore metabolism occurs that way. So there's some pathways it can take. One's anaerobic and one's aerobic. And one of those pathways being anaerobic metabolism, it doesn't require oxygen and it takes place in the cell cytoplasm. This pathway will make less ATP, but it's going to give you a quicker energy release. So if you need it quickly or energy quickly replaced during times of like really intense activity like exercising, that'll do it for you. The other type of metabolism, aerobic metabolism, it does require oxygen. And so this takes place in the cell's mitochondria instead. And this pathway, it makes more ATP or energy, but this also means it's going to take a longer time to do it. So when we use energy at a slower pace, aerobic is the ticket. So just to kind of reiterate those two types of metabolism, you have anaerobic, which is a shorter pathway with like a more immediate, quick result. And then you have aerobic, which makes more ATP, or that makes more of the energy, but it's a longer pathway and it takes more time. Regardless of the pathway though, you're taking glucose and you're breaking it down. So glycolysis is always the first step in either anaerobic or aerobic. Doesn't matter which, glycolysis is always that first step in that pathway. So hopefully from previous chapters or presentations, you know that glucose is the source of energy for our bodies. That's been mentioned many times. And when you have that glucose from nutrients you consume, you've got to break them down. And we call that breakdown of the glucose to release energy, we call that glycolysis. It takes enzymes, it takes different organs in our body, but to get it to that point and release that energy and to get it to pyruvic acid, the term is called glycolysis. So hopefully that's a little familiar to you. So this glycolysis, glucose is the starting point, and once it's split, so glucose, lysis means split. You now have 2 units of pyruvate. It's a compound we call pyruvate, and that's just the product of splitting those two, splitting that glucose. So once we have pyruvate from that glucose, we can take several pathways. We can take that anaerobic pathway or the aerobic pathway, as the slide shows. You don't need to memorize these, but you'll see them in like anatomy and physiology or physiology, microbiology classes, etc. So you have pyruvate, you're taking the anaerobic path, converting it to lactate, and releasing that quick energy. Whereas pyruvate that takes the aerobic path, it takes a slower pathway. And it actually ends up converting it to acetyl-CoA. So you're just taking glucose, you are breaking it down. The pathway pyruvate takes is dictated by what the body needs. Are we in a state of a lot of activity, or are we kind of in a state of rest? That just really determines whether you're going to end up with one product or another and how your body's going to break it down. So the anaerobic conversion of pyruvate to lactate, that lactate is just pyruvate with the added hydrogens and electrons after coenzymes give these back to pyruvate. Glycolysis is glucose to pyruvate, then to lactate. It's short, it's quick, energy pathway, and the process cycles through again and again. This slide is a kind of a representation of this fast process where those steps are done over and over, where lactate gets sent to the liver converts it back to glucose, and we can go through that glycolysis again. Pyruvate can also take the aerobic pathway, okay? So pyruvate moves through, it gets broken down. If it goes to lactate, then it accepts some hydrogens. It produces that ATP quickly. And you can also have the accumulation of lactate in muscles. If you get those muscle cramps, that's from that accumulation of lactate. And it's just part of that process of breaking down energy. So in terms of anaerobic and aerobic, pyruvate moves the mitochondria, and the process means that hydrogens and electrons are collected, and that pyruvate with its 3 carbons will lose a carbon, and the remaining 2 carbons will attach to an enzyme called acetyl-CoA. So here I'm showing you the glycolysis in terms of you've got a muscle, it's sending it through, you're breaking down glucose, it may be getting sent back to the liver in terms of it needs that fast, rapid energy. And it doesn't really have any other sources to pull it from, so it has to keep cycling that through in order to meet the needs of the body, especially if you're in high activity. However, the other pathway that I'm not showing here is the one where pyruvate actually switches to something else, but it's a longer process, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So just kind of think of that in terms of, what are the body's needs? What are the caloric needs? Are you in a state of rest, or are you an athlete and you need lots of energy? So the acetyl coenzyme A that I mentioned, that's the aerobic pathway. And so with the aerobic pathway, pyruvate now converts to something other than lactate, but it's converting to acetyl coenzyme A, or what we call acetyl-CoA. I'm not sure y'all remember different pathways or different things from chemistry class, but there were these GER or GER reactions and what I call LEO or LEO reactions. Well, LEO, loss of an electron, is often what we call oxidation. And so when pyruvate converts to acetyl-CoA, it's that type of reaction. So hopefully some of these things, if you've had chemistry or anatomy, are kind of sounding a little familiar. So we need energy, and glucose is split, and we get that pyruvate, right? Which then becomes either lactate or coenzyme A. So the oxidation process, it'll convert it over to coenzyme A. This little diagram shows some of the pathways of all those products when they're broken down and converted to energy through that catabolic and anabolic reactions. This one right here is about the oxidation of pyruvate, that loss of electrons. And you all do not have to memorize all these different models and how the atoms test through and exactly the bonds, but just keeping in mind that pyruvate is going to end up being acetyl-CoA or lactate, and those pathways are ones that lead to the metabolism of products that our body is taking in. So don't get too wrapped up in stuff. Some of the diagrams I'm showing you, it's just showing you like the trail of things, like right here. All right, sorry, I had a glitch. Yeah, this little diagram here, it just shows how the carbohydrates, fats, or lipids eventually reach ATP, and one compound is converted to another. So you're making energy, and you're often releasing electrons and hydrogens in that process, but don't trip on that too much. It's just, I have some slides here that show you kind of some more detail as how that transformation of carbs to glucose, or fats to fatty acids, or proteins to amino acids, and then eventually to ATP to fuel the body. So I know you all have heard of the Krebs cycle. It's also called the citric acid cycle, and you kind of see that in this slide. I'm not expecting you to memorize the Krebs cycle, but it is part of that process. And it's the final steps of energy metabolism in the body. And after those steps of metabolism, you can either have too much or too little energy, but kind of reflect back to how carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, fats, etc. are broken down from previous presentations, and think about the stuff that you've learned in other classes. So if you have an excess amount of energy, often what's going to happen is you're overeating, you're consuming too much, and when we eat more than the body needs, it's most likely going to be converted into fat. And I know we've mentioned that in previous slides or previous presentations as well. So if we consume too much, we have an excess. If we don't have enough nutrients, we have the opposite situation, and often this is called fasting. So you either have fasting or feasting. So if the body has depleted glucose, it doesn't have enough energy because maybe you're not eating enough or you're not getting enough nutrients, it's going to go to your glucose reserves or your glucose stores for fuel. All right. So this feasting or overeating versus fasting, a lack of nutrients. Fasting, it's a whole different situation. Once these glucose stores kind of get used up and you're running low, you have to find another way to fuel the body. If you run out of glucose, your body's going to have to find another way and make it. And in this situation, our body is making its own glucose. Amino acids that are used to make glucose are glucogenic, but then you have amino acids that get converted to acetyl-CoA, and they're called ketogenic. So if we're not getting enough energy and we're really desperate for some fuel to keep up with our body's demands and our activity, we have to break down our own body structures. So if we don't have glucose to use for fuel, we rely on ketones. We can use proteins or fats. Proteins are kind of like our last resort, because if we use proteins for our fuel, that means that we're breaking down our own body structures and muscle. And so we can also use ketones, and ketones are made from those 2 units of that acetyl-CoA. If we had glucose, we'd use it. But if we're using ketones, then that means we don't have the glucose available to make that fuel. Proteins or fats can be the basics for this, and using fats, we can make those coenzyme A's and then into ketones. So if you don't have enough glucose, then your body's going to start breaking stuff down. Using stores from the liver and the muscles, to avoid using all that, the body's going to use the fat, and then that gets converted to those ketones. If you have a rise in ketone levels, like in your urine, it could indicate that you're like diabetic, or you have diabetic ketoacidosis. So essentially you have high blood sugar, and hopefully some of you all have probably heard of that if you have like a urinalysis or blood draws. If you have a patient where that's happening and they have that increased blood sugar level, it just could indicate that they have increased ketone levels. And that could be somebody who's pre-diabetic or in diabetic ketoacidosis. Like this little image kind of illustrates an example of that. So when and how you use nutrients is really based on food consumption. You're either going to be in like a fed or full state, or a not fed state. And being full or using fuel reserves just depends on your activity level, etc. So you eat, your body taps into that glucose, and it begins making energy or ATP. And you have an abundance of glucose, you're going to store it as fat or glycogen. If your caloric demand, which often is based on your basal metabolic rate, which is like your gender, your age, your height, your activity level. How many calories you specifically need will depend on your energy need. So in previous presentations, we discussed some of this, and hopefully it came together a little bit in this metabolism presentation.